He felt it in the stomach first, the way you feel a dropped tool in the bilge, a jolt that suggests something unaccounted for. He took the frequency down and recorded clean, then opened the old logs not out of romance, but because the modern screens never seem to tell the whole truth. The ocean of that coordinate has a file. Sinkings, near misses. A night in September of 1954, when a storm sneaked in sideways and cut the horizon in half. A trawler that reported a failed light on buoy 14B, and then never came home. The logs held an aftertaste of the old way. Men in rubber coats writing with pencil while water crawled across the deck. There was a recording on magnetic tape in a cardboard box. A slow accretion of dust that had taken 40 years to settle. The old machine in the comms closet complained but obeyed, its motor turning up the sound of another midnight. Under the hiss there was a voice clinging to the edges of the band. We've lost the light. Can't find the mark. Something hits the hull, then a rattle, then the first 3 short tones, at 3:13 the second night. The pattern changed, it became letters, patiently cut. HELPME. He wrote it as if he were copying Latin without understanding, and when the sequence ended he found only his own breathing in the headphones, and felt briefly ashamed of the fact he'd held it. The cutter dispatched at dawn reported nothing but fog so uniform it seemed painted. The kind of white that punishes microscopes and cameras. The crew made circles and left wakes like finger marks on a mirror. They reported the smell of iron and something sweet, which is a ghost's favorite perfume and also the scent of kelp beds torn by storms. On the 3rd night the message arrived earlier, as if whoever sent it was eager or tired. And between the tones there were knocks, 6 metal taps, a pause, 6 again. Like someone working with a wrench in an engine compartment. Ellison knew that sound from drills, hull to hull signaling when radios fail. He counted them automatically, the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder. It was not fancy fear he felt. It was administrative dread. The dread of an irregularity that pointed outward, toward duty, rather than inward, toward superstition. He wrote the knocks into his log like a telegram, then stood and watched the door as if he expected a man in an old storm coat to walk in dripping and ask why the light was out. By the end of the week, the transmissions had become a second shift that bled into his first. Day work was paperwork and weather. Night work was this thread that the sea kept handing him like a line. He knew the protocols and obeyed them. He filed the reports hour by hour. He consulted with the electronics tech who wiped his hands and said, if something that old was talking, it was because something alive was carrying its voice for it. He called a NOAA contact who explained ducting so cleanly that for a moment the whole thing shrank down to physics. He slept in his truck for an hour after shift and woke with a taste of salt on his teeth. Men at sea learn not to confide fear out loud, because fear has a voice, and if you teach it your language, it speaks back. He did not tell the guys on the morning boat crew what he thought he might be hearing. He told them he was following a signal anomaly. There was a chapter in the station's own history that decided to wake while he listened. During the quiet panics of World War II, the Atlantic ran black, and the coastal convoys hugged the lighthouses like children near a parent's pant leg. The government taught civilians to watch the water and report what didn't fit. And there had been a watch post near this very station, where high school teachers and shopkeepers spent nights with binoculars in their hands. One entry described a winter when a buoy's light failed for 3 days and then returned, without repair. A neat bit of bureaucratic magic that no one explained to himself. The same buoy's designation, 14B, threaded from that era into the charts like a recurring dream. What war leaves behind is not always wreckage. Sometimes it leaves instructions that never got cancelled. The fourth night, the voice decided to be clear. The 3 tones arrived at 0041, as if the sea wore a watch. Then a carrier, a breath like someone putting their mouth too close to a microphone, and words stepped cautiously onto the floorboards. Position verified. Standing by. The voice was the kind of male you hear in training tapes from the 1960s. Vowels careful, consonants like gears. He should have been glad to get something so plain, but the hair on his wrist made little decisions all at once. He replied in the proper way: station identification, request for vessel name, request for number of souls aboard. He expected, in the sensible part of his mind, that nothing would answer. What came back was the same sentence again, identical as a stamp. Position verified, standing by. He recorded it, he played it back. On the second playback he heard, as if in a room behind the speaker, the strain of a hull complaining to waves, the metal's old vocabulary for weather. He isolated that band and found the lowest note of it belonged not to wind but to rust. What would you do with a voice that seems to be waiting at a buoy removed from service in the decade before you were born? You do what the manuals say. You escalate. The district approved a wider patrol with side-scan sonar, and the cutter came back with a thick braid of data that described a littered bottom, the stumps of old mooring blocks, and one object that looked like a submerged barrel set on its end. A diver went down when a rare clear day opened a window in the grey. He returned, cold and irritated, reporting visibility like milk and currents like tired hands pulling at his ankles. He'd felt, he said, the edge of a ring and the chain links big as a man's wrist. No buoy, nothing that could transmit. The tech stood in the comms room that afternoon and wanted the problem to be a wire, leaking like an old pipe, something to fix with a soldering iron and a sandwich. Allison wanted that too, but night is the sovereign of its own facts. He began to sense a schedule beneath the schedule, a loop that draped the same message across the same hour with the regularity of tides. On the 6th night, he did something he wouldn't put in the log. When the voice said, "Position verified, standing by," he asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask because it presumed the wrong thing. Standing by for who? There was a pause, and in that pause the ocean's entire mass seemed to lean in toward the shore. Then the voice delivered a name in a tone one reserves for roll call. Marion Bell. The logbooks are full of ordinary tragedies, which is to say ordinary for the sea, engine, weather, hull, A mistake you could put your finger on with a pen. The Marian Belle belonged to a small harbour 3 towns south, a boat of good reputation that went out on a September afternoon and failed to return. 3 men, Kane, Delaney, Ortiz, listed lost. No wreckage recovered. Men at the fisherman's bar still say that storm moved like a dog that's been kicked. Fast, mean, and unwilling to let go once it had its teeth in. The families kept pictures in narrow frames on mantels, and for a while every buoy light on that sector looked like an apology. The name had the weight of censers in Ellison's mouth. He set it back to the empty air and fed its temperature. The cutter's captain, an officer with the practical soul of a mechanic, suggested a test. Shut down short transmitters on that band, flood the area with controlled noise, see if the ghost could be blinded. They did. The voice arrived on time anyway, threading between jammers as if it had memorized the gaps. They shifted the sampling rate. The voice arrived in a matching key. They recorded its timing over 4 nights and found a pattern a meteorologist could admire. Something at that coordinate behaved like a clock. If a human being is kept from the end of a thing long enough, the end becomes the only destination worth traveling to. Ellison felt the pull in the second week like a tide working at the mooring rope. He brought an extra thermos and a photograph of the shore taken at dawn that he kept in his pocket to remind himself that light too exists. He carried the sense of being watched by something utterly indifferent, which is a fancy way of saying he felt the ocean being the ocean. The sound of the building at night became a catalogue he could recite. The heater relay's insect click, the window's dull complaint, the slow breathing of the backup generator, waiting for a storm that might not come. He did not tell anyone about the dreams, where the room filled with fog and the consoles were wet to the touch. On the 9th night, he heard a second voice under the first, the way you see a reflection under broken water. It was not words so much as pressure, a man deciding whether to speak. He increased the gain a hair's breadth, and the noise rose like a curtain. In that lift he caught the smallest sound a machine can hold. Someone swallowing. Then the first voice returned to its script as if embarrassed. Position verified, standing by. He understood, with a clarity that embarrassed him, that whoever or whatever spoke had nothing else to say. Scripts are comforting to the stranded. They give shape to the hour. The story threatens to turn dramatic all at once here, as if storm and revelation should arrive together, but the truth kept to the ocean's habit of attrition. The messages continued. The patrols continued. The report climbed a rung and then another. There were polite words like anomaly and artifact and seasonal ducting. There were less polite words in the parking lot, said softly through scarves. A technician in a denim jacket not issued by anyone in government took Ellison aside and talked about a phenomenon observed in test ranges where old beacons refused to go silent, even when their batteries were ash and their circuits submerged. He used terms like acoustic induction and galvanic memory, and then shrugged. Because the sea doesn't care about our terms, near the end of the second week, at 0041, the voice did something new. It delivered a coordinate that did not match 14 Bs. Ellison checked the numbers twice and then again, and wrote them down in the small handwriting that made room for fear on the page. The position was inland by a fraction of a mile, up the line of the river that slid out of town and into the sea like a knife into a sheath. A boy cannot drift upstream. Radios sometimes can. He called it in. By dawn, the cutter sat low and annoyed at the river mouth, while the small boat went up current past pilings like teeth. Fog had chosen the river that morning as its theatre. Men stood in rain gear in weather that had yet to decide what name to take. They found nothing but a dead seal and the smell of thaw. When the crew came back, a boatswain who had the polite meanness of the coast told Ellison plainly that if he was going to chase ghosts upriver, you should at least bring them coffee. That afternoon, the station received a call, not on the marine bands but on the landline, from a woman whose father had worked on the old buoy tenders. She'd heard through the braid of families that tie a coast together about a man listening to the past as if it were present. She asked a question without preface. "Did you hear the chain?" He could have lied. He said sometimes on the recordings, between the knocks, he thought he heard weight shift on a link. She told him the story that old tendermen like to fold into conversation, when it's almost closing time, that 14B was twice struck, once by a small freighter rolling in fog, once by a trawler that came too close when wind and current quarrelled. And that on the second strike a man went over, and the buoy went dark, and the chain, heavy as a promise, took him down far enough that the water remembered his shape. She apologized for telling him this, and then added that her father always said some gear keeps working out of habit, even after it's outlived its job. There is a point where a story stops being a riddle and becomes the work of living with what you know. Ellison adjusted his expectations and kept his post, as if the entire problem were paperwork. He logged, he recorded, he compared. He watched the minute hand consider the 41st minute of the first hour after midnight, as if it were a creature deciding whether to cross a road. He did not attempt to summon the voice by speaking first. He did not try to invent a new doctrine. And still the sea, consistent as a metronome and fickle as a cat, delivered the sentence with the patience of tidewater. Position verified, standing by. 3 weeks into the vigil, a storm with a proper name and a modern pedigree announced itself with all the banal detail of televised weather. The barometer slouched. The horizon vanished. The station tied down its trivialities and inventoried its seriousness. In that brawl of wind and water, the transmissions came louder, as if the storm boosted the one thing that should have been drowned. The voice cut through interference like a lighthouse through rain. The clock obeyed its ritual. He sat in the chair with the hood of his parka up, and the room shrunk to the radius of his breathing. At 2:12 a sound arrived that did not belong to radios. 3 brief hammerings from somewhere in the building below the comms room. He took the stairs 2 at a time and found the generator complaining to no one. When he returned, the recording had captured, beneath the sentence, a new word that he felt rather than heard. Home. No one can prove a machine meant a word. Not in weather, and not at sea. But he carried it all the same, the way you carry a coin in your pocket for luck, or a name in your mouth, when you walk into a room where things might change. When the storm receded, it left the world cleaner and worse the way storms do, and, out on the shelf, a scrap of net lifted, showed its face to the sun, and sank again. The cutter went out and found 2 buoys from a different district, a half-door, and a wayward lobster pot marker that had known better times. They found no light, no iron ring, no chain the size of a man's wrist. On the 31st night, precisely at 0041. The voice did not come. He waited one cycle, then two, and felt the absence as a weight. He watched the clock like a medic watches a chest. He checked the levels and the antennas and the patch cords that looked like snakes at rest. At 0049, the recorder picked up a sound like a body lowering into a chair. Then Ellison heard his own name, in a tone he had not heard since a training instructor years ago said it like a roll call. Ellison. The transmitter keyed and unkeyed once, like a blink. He answered the way you answer a door at night in a neighborhood that knows your name. The pause that followed had the feeling of someone standing on the other side of glass. Then the old sentence arrived one last time, but slowed, as if dragged. Position verified. Standing by. And then the carrier fell away, and the room filled with weather. And in the margin of his log he drew a short line and did not know why until later, when it looked exactly like a horizon. There is no epilogue. The sea owes us. The station's report went where reports go. A month later, a different watchstander took a different midnight with a different pencil. Ellison took his next duty at a small boat station farther down the chain and found that daylight is a tonic if you drink it regularly. Sometimes, when he walked the pier at dawn, he would stop where the frost thinned and listen for the minute that separates night from day, and think of a voice that kept office hours. In a diner that knew the tide tables better than the calendar, an old man in a cap shaped by years told him that once you mark a thing on the water, it keeps its shape longer than men do. He didn't argue. He hadn't come to argue with anyone. Years afterward, when the district upgraded its systems and retired a tangle of tapes and racks that had once been modern, a box of media surfaced long enough to be inventoried before disposal. Among the cassettes was one with a label in precise pencil, 0041, 14B. No one could play it on the machines at hand, and no one wanted to keep a memorial that looked like clutter. By afternoon, the box was gone, and by evening the river carried whatever it carries past the pier in its permanent hurry toward the sea. That night, far out where the charts grow more honest about uncertainty, a red light that should not exist lit, held for 9 seconds, and went dark. A fisherman who thought he'd imagined it kept the detail to himself, because you don't waste a good story by telling it to people who would make it small. If you stand on the breakwater on a winter night and tune carefully between the bands, you may find a seam in the noise where a sentence once lived. The physicists will tell you the troposphere makes strange mirrors when the air is set just so, and they will be right. The old tendermen will tell you that iron remembers, that chains hum with the history of their own weight, and they will be right. The families will tell you that names, once spoken with care, remain audible to those willing to listen, and they will be right. Somewhere between those rightnesses, a man once did his job so exactly that the sea had to answer him in kind, and for a span of midnights, the present and the past shook hands politely, and then let go. If you want an ending, here is one that belongs to no logbook. On a fogless July morning 2 summers later, a kayaker nosed over the gray shoal on a tide that forgave small mistakes. He looked down into water clear as green glass and saw, for the length of a breath, a circle of iron that had no business being visible, a ring furred with life and lit by a shaft of sun that seemed to have made an appointment. He reached toward it with his paddle, and the river wrinkled the image into absence. He told no one, because it did not feel like a thing to tell. It felt like a thing to have seen. And when night came, somewhere in the constellation of radios that stitch a coast together, a watchstander new to the habit of listening leaned into the hiss and learned the first lesson of the work, that what we keep by attention.